This week on Q&A, author and former Washington Post reporter Keith Richburg discusses his life in journalism and highlights of his reporting from China and North Korea.
Keith Richburg, what's the first thing you tell people about China?
The first thing I tell people when they ask me about China, friends coming over, people I meet coming over, people who aren't familiar with it, there is no one China. It's like talking about the United States as one entity, when in fact, New York is different from Texas, which is different from California, or someone from the South is different from someone from the North, although we're all Americans. And I always tell them China is a massive, diverse country. And if you're coming to visit, for example, I say, don't spend all your time just in Beijing or just in Shanghai. Try to go somewhere in between, try to go somewhere different, because the South in China is absolutely nothing like Beijing. It's absolutely nothing like Xinjiang. And if I have friends come to visit, what I love to do is just go out and just try some of the regional foods, Sichuan food, Hunan food, Xinjiang food, which is actually a lot closer to Middle Eastern food in a lot of ways, just to give people a flavor that, when we talk about China, as we do, especially in the newspaper, and I'm guilty of it too, the Chinese feel this, the Chinese feel that. It's really just a shorthand. There is no one China. So that's kind of the first thing I tell people.
What story have you written that has gotten the most attention in China?
That's a really good question. Well, I think obviously the Bo Xilai story, the story of the Cheng Communist Party chief who was then removed and jailed, involving this murder of a British businessman. That was really kind of exposed a lot of corruption and shenanigans at the high level of the Communist Party. That would be probably in the top 2 or 3. But I think the escape of Chen Guangcheng, the blind activist, probably got as much attention, especially from folks back here who were interested in the human rights question in China. That probably got as much attention as anything I've written. The Chen Guangcheng's escape from harsh treatment and illegal interrogation. I think partly because he's blind, in addition to being a human rights lawyer and activist, and somehow this blind activist escaped from these conditions with guards all around his village house, made his way, hundreds of miles from Shandong province to Beijing, and then was in hiding until he made his way into the U.S. Embassy. I mean, that really got a lot of attention, and that was a pretty dramatic story that happened over the last year.
How exclusive were those stories to you?
Well, I got the first phone call when he was actually being transported from the embassy to a hospital under an agreement with the Chinese government that the embassy made. That was partly accidental. He was calling the Washington Post because it was a former colleague of mine who's no longer with the Post, Phil Pan, who actually wrote a book called Out of Mao's Shadow, and he kind of had a chapter devoted to Chen, and he put Chen kind of on the map. So when he got, this guy had been under house arrest for a long time. I don't think he had a lot of access to outside media. And he just wanted to let the Washington Post know that he was away. So I actually got that first phone call. So that was and subsequently too, we had a lot of good relationships with not only with Chen and his allies, but some of his friends, his family members. So we were able to call pretty regularly to keep in touch with them, and they would call us when there were developments. For example, in the case of Chen's nephew, who was later jailed for an incident that occurred just after that escape. So we had pretty good contact with the Chen group and family members.
You're going to Harvard.
I am.
What for? I mean, have you left China for good?
I've left China for good. I'm going from one great institution to another, from the Washington Post to the Kennedy School at Harvard. Well, I'll be leading a study group on China, and it's going to meet during the spring semester of 2013. I'm going to be looking in different sections of this study group at the rise of the internet and what they call Weibo, social network. It's Chinese Twitter, the impact that's had. We'll take one session looking at the rise of the new generation of leadership in China under Xi Jinping to see what that will mean for the possibilities of reform. I want to take one session just to take a look at the media coverage, and specifically American media coverage of China, and how that shapes American perceptions. Because I think in the area of foreign policy more than anything else, the foreign media and how we cover things shapes how America views countries. So I want to spend one session devoted to how the media covers China. Do we write about human rights? Do we write about China's dramatic growth rates? Do we write about China as a competitor? Do we write about China in a kind of a glowing way about because their education system produces more graduates. So I want to look at specifically at that. And I want to devote another session to how China is used in American political campaigns. Because being in China and watching the campaign here, not just the presidential, but also some of the House races and Senate races, to see how China is thrown up often as a bogeyman, how China is used to scare voters on one side or the other side. So I think that a session devoted just to that will be terrific. I've got another session I want to devote just to China's intentions in the South China Sea and in the island dispute with Japan. I call that one, neighborhood bully with a question mark. And so what are China's real intentions? And I also want to look at some of the social issues involved. So I think, a series of study groups at the Harvard Institute of Politics will be terrific.
How long total have you spent in China and in Hong Kong?
I was in Hong Kong for about 4 to 5 years, from 1995 until 2000, basically. A lot of that was outside traveling in Southeast Asia, because that also was the time of the Asian economic crisis. But I was based in Hong Kong during that period. So 5 years then. And this time it'll be 3 years. I went in at the end of 2009. That was actually the time President Obama was making his first trip there. So I was there for that at the end. I think it was November of 2009. And then the Washington Post asked me to stay permanently. So I ended up staying through the middle of January of 2013. That was actually my first trip to China actually was 1985. So that was a very long time ago. So I always say I got to see China in the 80s, I got to see it in the 90s, traveling in and out from Hong Kong, and I got to see it most recently. So I've seen really the development.
Been with the Washington Post from what year?
I started as a summer intern in 1978.
And what different places have you lived in the world since you first went there as an intern for the Post?
For the Post, yeah, absolutely. My first job was overseas was 1986, when I was posted to the Philippines. This was right after the fall of Ferdinand Marcos. I stayed there for 4 years. And then at 1991, I went to Nairobi, stayed there from 91 until 95. And that's January 95 is when I went to Hong Kong. From 95 to 2000, I was in Hong Kong, and also spent a lot of time in Indonesia during that period as well. That was during the fall of Suharto. In the year 2000 is when I moved to Paris, which was a great job. I became the Paris bureau chief for the Post. That also was a period that coincided with the, obviously, 9/11 and later the invasion of Iraq. So from Paris, I was also in Iraq and Afghanistan quite a bit. I came back in 2005, so 5 years based in Paris, but traveling pretty much everywhere. Came back to Washington in 2005 to be foreign editor for a couple of years. And then in 2007, I went to New York to be the New York bureau chief, which was another fantastic job. I got a little piece of the 2008 presidential election during that time. And then it was in 2009 they asked me to go back to China, first to fill in and then to take the bureau over full time.
You were here in 97. I want to show a clip of that when you were here for a book about Africa, when you were stationed over there in Nairobi in Kenya. Where did you actually live?
Based in Nairobi.
Okay, let's watch this and then
Sure.
We'll continue.
Actually, no, I say I don't hate Africa and I don't hate the Africans. What I end up saying is that I hate the corruption, I hate the brutality, I hate the inhumanity. I hate the kids who point guns in my face. I hate the big men who spirit away billions in the Swiss bank accounts. I hate the maddening propensity of Africans to kind of roll over and wallow and endure this suffering without taking to the streets and doing more to demand their own rights. I hate the people who toss fire bombs into the offices of opposition newspapers. I hate just the way people can walk by suffering.
That's a long time ago, about 15 years ago.
Powerful stuff.
What was the impact of that book?
That book got a lot of feedback, and almost all of it was positive. I got some negative, but almost all of it was positive. I think the negative voices were a little bit louder at the time. But a lot of people were saying basically to me, the negative side were saying basically to me, how could you say, we're not disagreeing with what you said, but how could you air this dirty laundry out? That's going to give opposition, or that's going to give ammunition to those who want to oppose further aid to Africa or further involvement with Africa. So why are you spreading this dirty laundry out? There was also a strain of anger from some people saying you only got the bad parts. You're not looking at the good parts of Africa. And among the people who enjoyed the book, many were African Americans, many were diplomats, many were aid workers. They all wrote to me. They came up to me after book signings often whispering because they didn't want to say it publicly, saying, I was there, I agree with what you said, I just didn't have the courage to actually say it. And I was really heartened by the number of people who would come up to me afterwards. Literally, they would hear me getting shouted down by angry people, and they'd come up afterwards and say, could you sign a copy of the book? I really agreed with every word you said in here. I still get emails almost every week or every month about the book. Usually people have found it somewhere on a library shelf, or people going to the Peace Corps have now started picking it up, and I've gotten a lot of feedback. I actually went back to Africa in 2007, I believe, 2006, and looked around and just to update it. So I wrote a new preface in 2008 or so. I wrote a new preface to it that actually took account of Obama's election at that point, just to be able to, because I wanted to test myself to see if some of the things I wrote then were still true. And sadly, too many of them were true.
What impact has it had on anything that the president has a Kenya connection, President Obama?
It really has, and I actually said this in the new preface to the book that I wrote at, taking into account Obama's election, was it really made me convinced that the U.S. was really the land of possibility for black people specifically. And when I saw the idea that this guy could rise from this kind of mixed race background and get elected president in a country that's where his people who look like him are not the majority, it really says something good about America. And I think that was the whole point of the book that I was trying to get that some people actually missed, was that this was a real place of promise and opportunity for black people. And that people in Africa are now looking at the U.S. in a different way as a place of real promise and opportunity. And I think so I think the election of Obama was a fantastic thing. And that's not just for Africa, it's all over the world, from traveling all over the world, and specifically in Asia now. I'm amazed now when I go to Indonesia and I'm checking in and at the airport, and the immigration officer looks at my passport and looks at me and says, Obama, #1. Or taxi drivers in Beijing will look over and say, oh, Obama, I like Obama. He has really changed the perception of African Americans, of black people around the world, for some. And I really do think that's something that's intangible.
What's your reaction after living all over the world to the statement that a lot of politicians make, and just people who call this network, that the United States is the greatest country in the world?
Well, I think it's a great country too. I think it's an exceptional country in a lot of ways for the reasons I just mentioned. The Obama election, to me, crystallized in many ways why this is such an exceptional country, because I lived in France, as I told you, for 5 years, and I tried to imagine myself, would there ever be a black president of France? I tried to imagine myself in China. Would there ever be a minority? China has 52 or 53 minority groups. Would there ever be a non-Han Chinese elected to any high office in China? But in our lifetime, I tried to imagine in what other country would this kind of thing be possible other than in the U.S. So the greatest country in the world, I try to stay away from superlatives. Everybody thinks their own country is great in many ways. I always try to say it's just a real exceptional country and that's why it's exceptional, because we're a people that everybody came from somewhere else, in a lot of ways. At some point, if you go back far enough, everybody came from somewhere else. And the fact that in now not one election, but 2 elections, people were able to look past color and whatever prejudice that they have and elect Barack Obama, someone with the name Barack Obama, Barack Hussein Obama, twice, I think makes this a pretty amazing place.
Born in Detroit. Parents alive?
No, my father passed away in 2007.
Because the last time you hear, of course, he was alive. Your mom,
That's right.
I think, had already passed. What would they think of Keith Richburg, and what would they say is the reason that you've been so successful with the Post and traveled all over the world? Where did it come from?
Well, I'd hope they'd be proud. I'd hope they'd be happy that I did what I always wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer. And, I thank the Post for giving me the opportunity to live in different places and travel and write. I think they were a little bit skeptical. They didn't know what this kind of thing was. My dad was a factory worker. My mom was a homemaker, who did various odd jobs. And, I think this idea that, I wasn't going to be a lawyer, or it wasn't going to be something they understood where you could have a salary and make money. Writer, how are you going to make money? How are you going to support yourself? But the fact that I was able, #1, to not only do that, but I think in a way that made them proud, where I could support myself and travel around the world, I think would make them happy. And I think parents are always happy when they see their kids happy, and they knew I was always chomping at the bit to travel. I think there was something about growing up in the Midwest that makes you want to go out and see the rest of the world. When you grow up in Detroit, in those days, going to Canada was a big deal. And so I always just wanted to travel and get out and see different places. So, the fact that I was able to go and to get a master's degree at the London School of Economics, I mean, my mom was alive then. She was just absolutely thrilled at that. And I know, parents don't always say things to their kids, but I could tell later on when my dad died and I went to his funeral and I heard everybody coming up to me and saying, "Oh, he talked about you all the time." And funny, after my dad passed away and after a long illness and I was kind of cleaning out his house, I found he had saved a lot of old articles of mine, including some old articles I'd written in high school and some old articles I'd written in college. And he had actually saved the clippings somewhere, and I'd found these. And I said, well, he never told me he'd save these things. This is a nice touch.
So where did it come from, though? Where did your interest? Do you have anybody back there in your life that you say that they pushed me in that direction, or was it all from within you?
Well, obviously it was my parents, my mom and my dad. But my dad primarily always saying he always said, whatever you do, try to be the best at it. I don't care what you do, just make sure you just try to be the best. Just don't settle for second best. So he always really instilled that. So I think he was the real source of the inspiration that you can do whatever it is you want to do. He also was he didn't have a chance to go to university, but he was one of the smartest guys I ever knew. Self-read. He would say something to me, well, didn't you know that Abraham Lincoln once said this? And I would say, oh, how would he possibly know that? And sure enough, I'd go and look it up and see it was true. Yeah. So he was one of the smartest guys. The house was always filled with books, and he was a real reader. So I think that part came from him. In terms of inspiration, there are a lot of people who helped me along the way. I'd have to say, first of all, I didn't even know how to put my interest in writing with my interest in journalism together. I didn't quite know how that clicked until I went to see that movie, All the President's Men. And I remember watching that and watching the heroics of the two journalists on screen, never knowing that one day I'd be working at the same organization. And that's when it all kind of came together. And I said, that's what I want to do. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to be the journalist. I want to be the correspondent. And then there were some great people who helped me along the way. Former city editor, now deceased, Herb Denton, at the Post, who brought me in under his wing. Don Graham, of course, has been a real mentor. Len Downey, former editor of the Post, was with me pretty much the whole way.
But when you look back over the places you've been, have you changed your attitude about living overseas, and are you back here for good?
Well, I never say anything for good. Back here for now. I know the experience of living overseas is fantastic, and I'll always treasure that. I always want to be able to travel and go back overseas again. Not sure if I'll have the chance to live permanently again. I never say anything's permanent.
Are you still with the Post?
I've just left the Post. I've just decided after 34 years it was time to move on and do some new things. I'm going to do this at Harvard. I'm going to try some teaching. I'm going to try some academic stuff. And primarily, I wanted to try some more writing. After the book came out on Africa, many people who have been writing me these emails, and a lot of friends and colleagues, including my agent, have been saying, when are you going to write another book? You got to write another book. And I got to say, I've been chasing daily deadlines and doing all these stories for so long that I haven't actually had time to sit down and develop a book. And, as I started looking at it, I said I'm 54 years old, about to be 55. I don't have a whole lot of time if I want to write a few more books. And so that was kind of the reason I decided that, I had this great opportunity after the New York Bureau to go to China, which was completely unexpected. I got to be there at an exciting time of the leadership transition. I said, this is the time now to step back and use these last healthy years you've got left. I hope it's a long time to just try to do write more types of writing, and specifically book writing. So it's real difficult to leave the Post after 34 years, but it just seemed like if I want to write more books and do more things, this is the right time to do it.
If you live in Washington, and I obviously do, and you pick up the Washington Post, this is often contained inside the Post.
That's right.
It's contained inside the New York Times. A version of it is contained in the Wall Street Journal. Is this propaganda?
It's basically Chinese government, Communist Party owned newspaper that they pay to put that in as a supplement. The Russians do a similar one. There are various countries that do that. The Chinese are putting it in a big way now. The Chinese media is coming into the U.S. in a big way. It does raise questions as to whether newspapers should be allowing these kind of supplements inside, these kind of paid supplements. I think as long as it's made clear that this is not a Washington Post product and we don't endorse what's in there, I think it's probably okay. As you know, all newspapers are struggling now, so they're probably not going to financially turn down anybody who's offering to pay money for something like that. But I think it's in this case with China Daily, it's it's a tough call. I think our ombudsman looked at that a couple of times. As long as it doesn't affect the journalism of the newspaper, and as long as it's made clear that it has nothing to do with the Washington Post's editorial policy, then I think it's actually probably okay. China Daily is an interesting one. China Daily and another one called Global Times, this one's owned by Xinhua, the other one's owned by the People's Daily. They're trying to at least present themselves as objective newspapers. Now, obviously, they have their point of view specifically on their editorial page, but they're trying to do a better job at putting in real news. And that's because they're getting real competition inside of China, particularly from young Chinese who have now turned to media, Weibo, which is Chinese Twitter, social networking sites for news. And so they know that just the old style of putting propaganda, just complete propaganda junk in the paper isn't going to sell the paper anymore. So they're actually trying. And they've got some leeway in areas that are not too overtly political. If they want to write about environmental issues, that's pretty much fair game. If they want to write about some local level, regional level corruption issues, that's pretty much fair game. If they want to write about traffic problems in Beijing, obviously fair game. So, there are areas there now. So I wouldn't call it complete propaganda. I would say the editorial page is going to obviously be tightly controlled. Political stories are tightly controlled. But you've got a lot of good young journalists who are working for papers like that, who are trying to push the envelopes of censorship.
Okay, for the moment, though, here's Keith Richburg, former Washington Post reporter. You're sitting in Beijing. You are the bureau chief of the Washington Post. You know that there's hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent by the Chinese government for this publication to be inserted into the Washington Post. Does that affect the way you report? Does it affect the way the Chinese look at you? Does that money get in the way?
I hope not. It doesn't affect me, and I deliberately try to divorce myself from anything that has to do with China Daily. In fact, we had a high-level team, the publisher and the editor of the Post were out in China taking a tour around and taking a look. And, the China Daily even set up a lunch for them as a courtesy, just to be able to meet the publisher and the executive editor. This was a couple of years ago. I declined to go to that lunch, because I said, that would put me in a bad position, because I have to cover this place. So I would go along with to them with appointments that I thought were appropriate. There were other appointments they had where I just declined to go, because I think as the correspondent, you have to kind of put a little bit of distance between yourself like that. It may create the perception among some in China that we have some kind of a relationship with China Daily, because they may not understand this kind of, we call it the wall of church and state between the business side and the editorial side, or the news side of a newspaper. I would try to explain to people that we have nothing to do with China Daily, other than I use them as a source, actually, when I was in China. And I think as I read it every day, I would get it delivered. But the idea that there would be some kind of a change in the way I would cover something would just not be accurate.
If you, and I'm sure you've heard this, if you live here in this country, you hear some politicians say we need to spend a lot more money on defense in the Southeast Asian area, in the China Sea area. How concerned should we be about the Chinese in the future militarily?
I think it's a worry. I think it's a worry just because they have not made their intentions clear. Their defense spending is very opaque. We don't know quite where all the money is. We don't really know how much is being spent. Only part of their budget is public. There's a whole other section of their budget that we don't know anything about. It's basically off the books, and that would include their space program. That would include everything about nuclear modernization. So we only know a portion of what they spend. There's been a lot more bellicosity, a lot more rhetoric, a lot more words directed both towards the Southeast Asian countries in terms of that island group, but also towards Japan with the Senkaku, where they argue over what the name of the island chain is. But there's a lot more rhetoric, a lot more bellicosity. They've made it plain that they're going to really push what they consider their territorial rights in a lot more of an aggressive way than they did before. And this is kind of China's way of saying now they are a great power, now they are a rich country, and they can no longer be pushed around by these, what they consider smaller countries around them. I personally don't see it opening up into a shooting war yet. I think, and this is just my speculation on this, I think even generals in the Chinese military know that outright hostilities would be bad for the region, it would be bad for the economy there. I think they're hoping mainly to just intimidate to get their way, so they don't have to have any kind of outright hostilities. But I think there's always, when you've got a lot of ships like that in close proximity to each other, there's always a chance that somebody's going to do something wrong. Somebody's going to pull a trigger when they shouldn't have pulled a trigger. And, you have to remember how World War I started. It was all, with Archduke Ferdinand, a small thing can blow into a big thing. So I think the U.S. is probably right to stay on guard there. I think there has to be some way to kind of, try to bring the tensions down and get sides talking again, as opposed to kind of taking, these unilateral military maneuvers. It's a tough thing to negotiate because the Chinese are not budging from their insistence that these islands, both the ones in the South China Sea and the ones that Japan are claiming, are theirs historically.
Put this in context, though. They own $1 trillion of our debt. The trade imbalance is in their favor, much more than ours. The Walmarts of this world have 70-80% of their products that they sell coming out of China. How could you get a war out of this?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I say a shooting war seems to me highly improbable, because it would affect not only trade with these Asian countries, and China's trade with the Asian countries is as important as their trade with us, if not more so. It would affect the entire balance of our economies, which are so, as you mentioned, so increasingly intertwined. I don't see it going to that level. It's a question, and again, I said this. This is partly what I said in the beginning about how China is really a diverse country. It's not one China. It's many Chinas. 1.3 billion people, probably more now. I think you're going to see the next census showing it's really 1.4 or more.
How many cities have 1 million people in it,
Oh, they've many. I mean, there are cities that most people, including I, have never heard of that are over 1 million people now. I mean, now in China now you're talking about cities of 15 million, 10 million people, which are huge. But in addition to that, the diversity is also within the government. There is no one Chinese government view. There's the foreign ministry, which has, I think, a more accommodating view, or more willingness to negotiate on some of these issues. There's the military, which has been taking, which in the point of view of some generals, if you read their writings, has been taking a much tougher line in these island disputes. Then there's the state council. There's Xi Jinping as president. There's there are all kinds of views going on here, and also even within the media, you see some really tough views on some of these island disputes. But the attempts of sometimes of the foreign ministry to try to tone it down. So I think we can't read one general writing in a military magazine saying we must be prepared for war and say, aha, that means China is bellicose. It just means one general is saying that and writing that.
If there was a showdown with North Korea, which side would China be on?
Well, North Korea, clearly, but I think they would have the interest in trying to mitigate that as much as possible.
When did you go into North Korea?
I was in North Korea November of 2011.
Got some video. You shot it. What did you shoot it with, by the way?
I shot it with a very small Canon camera that I could actually keep concealed, mostly under my jacket. We were all told not to shoot video of most things in North Korea. We were only supposed to shoot sort of monuments and that sort of thing. So I had to kind of surreptitiously shoot it.
Did people know you were shooting? Anybody there figure out that you were shooting this?
I don't think they did, actually. And in fact, I made some. I made clear once I was leaving, actually, to download things on the computer and to switch around my little scan disk to make sure even if they found it, that they wouldn't be able to actually confiscate everything that I had. When we left the airport, I was part of a small group that went in. I even saw them going through people's cameras, deleting images that they didn't want seen. So I made clear that I didn't have those things on my camera at the time. I made sure every time I shot something to go back and download it onto my computer and hide it in multiple places and multiple files.
Here is your video. Let's watch.
Most of what tourists can see here in Pyongyang has to be glimpsed from the windows of a moving bus. Tourists are taken to various memorials and attractions around the city, like the Victory Arch and Kim Il-sung's birthplace and Kim Il-sung Square. But it's really, really difficult to get a look at daily life, since your tour group is really kept isolated from ordinary people. You can't mingle, you can't just go to restaurants, you can't go to normal shops and have a look around. These images were shot from the window of a moving bus as we were going through Pyongyang on the way from one tourist attraction to the other. Getting into North Korea is rare, particularly for journalists. And once I was invited in, we were told not to take photographs of ordinary people, so these are really pretty rare images coming out. I left my hotel early just to get a glimpse of daily life, and what you see in Pyongyang is a city of few private cars, most people walking or riding bicycles. Work groups, they're called work teams here, often walk together to their jobs on construction sites, and they're usually walking behind a leader carrying a big red banner or flag. There are roads being repaired and new houses being built for 10,000 families. That's all in preparation for ceremonies next year, which will mark the 100th birth anniversary of the country's founding leader, Kim Il-sung, who's still referred to here as the Great Leader.
What do they think they're gaining by having such a closed society?
Continuing their absolute control, basically. You know, the one thing they always say is, as the title of a book by my colleague Barbara Demick is, "Nothing to Envy." They would always say, you North Koreans, you have nothing to envy when you look at the West, and specifically when you look at South Korea, you know, because we have everything here and they envy us. You have nothing to envy. I think if they start allowing in the internet, if they start allowing in newspapers and magazines from abroad, and even specifically if they start allowing in more Western tourists who are allowed to walk around freely and mingle with North Koreans, they might see they do have a lot to envy. That their country, despite the pronouncements of the great leader and the dear leader and the son, I mean, their country is desperately poor. Their country is desperately far behind in terms of any kind of mechanized infrastructure, any kind of transportation infrastructure, any kind of agricultural infrastructure. They're desperately far behind. Even China, which is now, even pushing North Korea now to adopt some of their opening and economic reforms.
What's the difference between the communism of North Korea and the communism of China?
The communism of China basically is communism in name only these days, and it preserved the power of the members of the Communist Party. But they basically threw most ideology aside when Deng Xiaoping opened the country up, and it's now become a capitalist haven. The communism now in China, they talk at great length at these party congresses about Marxist Leninism, etc. But as I said, it's all about preserving the party's power economically as the country continues to grow, because they threw aside most vestiges of communism a long time ago. In North Korea, it's all about preserving the power of the military and the Kim dynasty, as you have there. And again, it really has nothing to do with, I think, what Karl Marx envisioned as communism way back. Somebody could do a fascinating book somehow on how communism, when it moved into Asia, diverged into something different in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, China, North Korea, than the communism that appeared in Europe and the Eastern European countries. That's an absolutely fascinating split that occurred.
So if you live in China, how much do you see or hear about the United States that's without editing and without censorship?
It's a lot. Chinese are obsessed with the United States in a lot of ways. They like to compare themselves to the United States. Average people on the street compare themselves to the U.S., or they want to know what's happening in the U.S. Stories about the U.S. election were on the front page of the Chinese newspapers, and they editorialized about it. They had editorial cartoons about the U.S. election. Now, partly that's because China was mentioned quite frequently, specifically by Mitt Romney, who was promising to label China a currency manipulator and all these other things. But
Are they, by the way?
Oh, sure, yeah. They absolutely do manipulate their currency. They have also allowed the currency to float, relatively openly in a relatively constrained band over the last couple of years. So when I arrived, the currency was about 7.5 or so to the dollar. Now it's about 6 to the dollar. So it has actually strengthened quite a bit against the U.S. dollar. So it's unfair to say that how China was in 2009 is the same as it is now. The currency has actually gotten a lot stronger.
But do they watch our movies? Do they watch our television programs? Can they read the internet from here? And can they watch YouTube?
The internet is controlled by what's called the Great Firewall. That keeps out basically Facebook, YouTube. New York Times is now banned because they wrote some stories on the wealth of the prime minister, who's soon to be former prime minister. A lot of Western sites are banned, including sites from Hong Kong or Taiwan. But a lot of young, savvy Chinese, especially in the urban areas, have virtual private networks, VPNs, and so they're able to get around the Great Firewall. So it's a kind of a cat and mouse game. The Great Firewall gets higher, Chinese find new ways around it or new holes inside of it. So it's a real way that the government is trying to constrict what people can see and read.
Go back to that just for a second, back to the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
If the New York Times cannot be read in China, how then does the Chinese government buy space in the New York Times to be delivered in this country? Does that still happen, or have you asked anybody about that?
I have not asked specifically about that, but that's the irony of it. For example, Twitter is banned, officially banned. A lot of Chinese are on Twitter using these VPNs, but Twitter is banned. On the other hand, Xinhua, the official Chinese news agency, has a Twitter account, and they're tweeting every day stories. And so a lot of us have pointed out the irony that Xinhua is using Twitter to get its message out to Americans, but they're banning it for Chinese people in China to see.
When you go to the Kennedy School at Harvard, isn't one of the daughters of one of the major leaders in China going to school there now?
Yeah, the daughter of Xi Jinping was enrolled there, as was the son of Bo Xilai, who was the Cheng chief. He was at the Kennedy School. A lot of the leaders, and this is a story that one of my colleagues at the Post did, a lot of the leaders sending their children overseas for education. A lot of sending their families overseas to live. These are known in China as naked officials, meaning that they live there inside of China, but they try to send their family and their money abroad as a way of kind of keeping a foot out the door in case things go wrong. And
does the public in China know that?
Yes, they know that. That's the interesting thing is, even though the government goes to great lengths to ban what people can read, not let you get on Twitter, not let you read the New York Times, people are very savvy, very smart. These things get out there among the Chinese public. Some of these stories will get translated into Chinese and slipped out through Weibo, and Weibo is Chinese Twitter. It will get taken down, of course, but not before it's been retweeted, 50 other times, or in China, a million other times.
Can we read Weibo here?
You can if you can read Chinese. Most of it's in Chinese, but you can get a Weibo account, and you can read what they're doing. I often wrote stories based on what was in Weibo, because that's really I call it the Chinese water cooler. It's a way we now know what average people are thinking in a real live time way.
Can you, living in Beijing when you were, how long were you there, by the way?
3 years.
Could you read the New York Times there on the internet?
I had several VPNs, or virtual private networks, that allowed me to get around the Great Firewall.
Could you buy the New York Times and the Washington Post anywhere, the physical?
Physical, you could buy the International Herald Tribune, which of course reprints now mostly New York Times. It used to be jointly Washington Post and New York Times.
Chinese allowed to buy those?
Well, it's a good question. I think if they probably could go into the place, which was usually an international hotel, which was selling it, then sure they could walk up and buy it. Not that many people actually will buy an English newspaper and read it in English, so that's a big barrier. The New York Times just started a Chinese language website, hired a huge army of translators, and then, of course, that's been banned now since their story about the Prime Minister came out.
The largest number of students in American universities from other countries from China.
That's right.
What impact is that having on anything? In other words, how many of them come over here as, probably shouldn't use the word, but spies? I'm sure some of them must be here for the government. And then how many of them stay here? And how many of them go back then and take what they've learned here about democracy? And does that make any difference?
That's a really good question. It's a fascinating question. It's one I'd like to look more at when I start down this new track where I'm going to be spending some time at Harvard and other places. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the problem with Chinese students coming here was that they never wanted to leave. So the Chinese government was very reluctant to let people go unless they had family members back there who could be almost held hostage in a weird way. Because what happened was people would come here, get the education, and then find the opportunities here and jobs here, and they not want to leave. Now people are starting to go back. And this is not just because, some because they're actually patriotic, they're being sent over by the party to get the education and come back. You've got another group, they're just young people who are being sent over by their families, private money, to fund their education over here. And they realize that there are more opportunities in China. If you're a young guy and you're interested, or a young woman and you're interested in having a computer startup, you're probably going to do a lot better off, launching that startup in China than you are now in the U.S., where it's a lot more regulation and the market's crowded. If you're a young designer, you might do a whole lot better in China than you do back here. So you got a lot of people who are coming here for the skills, and then deciding that, I can pretty much make my money back in China more than I can make it here. So that's to me, that's a fascinating trend, is that the people are actually starting to go back voluntarily to China because they see China as just a booming, open economy now.
What do they do better than us?
They do several things. I'm not better. I'm not sure. In a different way, they can build things and move things a lot quicker than we can. Partly that's because they don't have our regulatory regime, they don't have our environmental protection regime. But one of the most amazing things to me was, I'm coming back to New York where I lived. I come and see New York now, and I see we're still building the World Trade Center towers after they were destroyed in 9/11. Here it is, how many years later, and they're still building it.
12
years later, we're still building that. I think they call it Freedom Tower now. I've watched buildings go up and be torn down in China in just a few years. It's just absolutely amazing the speed with which they can put things up.
Are they well built?
That's a good question. We'll know in a decade or so. We built buildings here to last. I talked to some architects in China, American architects who are making their living now in China, because among other things, they say if you want to build skyscrapers, China's the place to be. It used to be here. Nobody in Europe's building skyscrapers, really. The Middle East, not so much anymore. That was 10 years ago. Asia is the place you want to be, and China. I talked to a lot of American architects who said one of the beauties of it is you can actually watch your design be built in front of your eyes and actually see it go up. But they also said, we built buildings here to last 100 years. Look at some of our iconic buildings, Empire State Building, the Sears Tower. Some of these buildings were built 100 years ago, and they were meant to last that long. In China, they want to build a building. If it can last 20 years, that's great, because by that time somebody will tear it down and put something else up there. So they're not looking at a building that's going to be an iconic building for the next 100 years. They're looking to make money out of it now.
What about the trains?
High-speed train is another area where they've made a decision to build these things, and they obviously had some problems. The railroad minister was jailed for corruption. He's still being investigated. And they had this huge crash in Wenzhou that took, I believe, 40 lives. This was a huge setback to them, but they came right back within weeks ago, launching this new high-speed line that now goes from, it'll take you from Beijing to Guangzhou, and later on it'll extend all the way to Hong Kong in a little over 8 hours. It's a trip that used to take a couple of days. They really have a dream for building this network out and eventually connecting China to Europe by high-speed rail.
What's the motivation, though? I mean, in this country, we often see the motivation being the competition, the chance to make a lot of money, build a company. What's their motivation?
Well, their motivation, one motivation actually was their stimulus program. They avoided the fate that we did in 2008 with a massive government spending program that put people to work, that put government money into investment. So it was investment-led growth that kept the Chinese economy booming along at 10% and then now down to 7% or so. Even while the rest of the global economy was flattening out, it was all of this infrastructure spending. They're building out their infrastructure while they've got the money to do it. Some people say these could end up being white elephants. It's a debatable point, because once the tracks are there, once the lines are there, it'll always be there. It'll always be something they can use. They're building out everything, not just high-speed rail. They're building out airports. They're buying most of the world's airplanes right now. In terms of the big wide-bodied jets. They're building out their highway system. Their highway system is going to surpass the United States highway system in a few more years. They're building all this out now because they see China's on the rise. They've got 1.5 billion people they've got to worry about moving around. And the other motivation for this is they see China as being able to link itself to Europe through trade routes more if they can build out these high-speed train networks. Right now, the only problem China has is you've got all this development along its eastern coast, where the ocean is there, Shanghai, Guangdong, Fujian, Zhejiang, some of these provinces. The inland provinces haven't seen that kind of growth yet. And that's because if you're an American factory coming in there, you want to be able to export your stuff out quickly. And if you're building in one of these inner provinces, it's hard to move the stuff. So high-speed train does one thing. It gets passengers off the freight lines, and you can actually move stuff a lot quicker.
A lot of people here don't think they play by the rules. Things like records that they copy and sell, and movies they copy and sell, and all the rights questions that come up on trade, on currency manipulation, all that. What's your sense of the character? Is there a difference between the character of the Chinese person and the Chinese government?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's pretty accurate that they don't play by the rules in most cases. I think they bend the rules to fit their circumstance. I think Americans and a lot of Westerners tend to be a lot more legalistic when we go into things. We want things on a contract. And once we see things are written down on a contract, we think, well, that's the be-all and end-all. Whereas the Chinese will sign any contract or agree to any trade agreement, and then the minute the ink is dry, they'll try to figure out a way to interpret it to get around its requirements.
Where's that come from?
It's just a relentless drive to try to get ahead. It's sort of what's built the place over the last 30 years, this kind of booming economy, this relentless drive to get ahead, to get better, to improve. They see some of the constrictures that we put on them in terms of trade, in terms of these agreements. They see that from their perspective is we are trying to hold China down. We basically operated in a world without rules for years to build our economy up, and now that we've got to the top, we're trying to hamstring them, or we're trying to tie them up in a knot of rules and regulations to hold China down. And you could say the same about climate change issues. You know, a lot of people see that, wait a minute, you allowed your economy to grow over many, many, many years, and you polluted up the air, and now that China is growing, you're saying, oh, hold on, you know, we have to control our factories' output, and we have to control what we're polluting. So a lot of people actually see these rules and regulations as things that are aimed at holding China down.
How much credit in the surge in Chinese activity and success do they give, or should we give to the Nixon initiative?
Well, the Nixon initiative was the key that actually opened up, U.S. relations with China, and there's a reason there's that saying, a Nixon in China moment, that it had to be a anti-communist Cold Warrior like Richard Nixon that opened that bridge to communist China. And I just watched a movie by Mike Chenoy, a fascinating movie about that period, the opening to China. The day, I think they call it the day that changed the world, or something like that.
Is that the Mike Chenoy, formerly of CNN?
Formerly of CNN, that's right. Actually, and he's now with University of Southern California, putting together archival footage, including one to mark the anniversary that just passed of the Nixon trip. And it was absolutely fascinating hearing some of Nixon's people talk about that period when they were actually afraid of some backlash from the right wing, because they were basically going to be seen as abandoning Taiwan in favor of China. But Nixon actually saw that you had to make this kind of pivot, and he was the one who could do it. I mean, Jimmy Carter came later. I can't see Jimmy Carter ever having gotten away with something like that.
So if China succeeds and becomes the #1 country in the world in goods and money and all that, should we have ourselves to blame?
Well, I'm not sure we should say ourselves to blame. I think we should say ourselves to credit. I think a booming China helps the United States in a lot of ways.
How?
As well, because our economies are so connected and so interdependent. We're selling more to China now. For example, I'll give you just one example. I did a story, and I'm from Detroit, so I got kind of cars in the blood. I did a story about how General Motors was basically bankrupt in 2008, and they were saved largely by China. There's China, and I talked to the head of China sales there. Same with Ford, as a matter of fact, but to a lesser extent, because they didn't have the same problems here. But in General Motors said, yeah, but at the time that they weren't selling cars. They were still in the United States. Their business in China is booming and still continues to boom. China now builds more cars and buys more cars than the United States does. And that trend is only going to get bigger and bigger as you get these Western provinces that I talk about getting richer and richer. So, yeah, we're selling more to China now. That's big for us.
I want to go back to a story that you talked about earlier and run some video from you this is from the Washington Post website, and this was the Chen story.
Yes.
Give us the time frame.
This would have been around May of 2012.
The gentleman with the sunglasses on in the wheelchair,
Yes.
blind.
Yes, blind.
Where is he today?
He's now at New York University. He got out after this period where he escaped from his village in Shandong, made it to the U.S. Embassy, which sheltered him for a few days, then reached an agreement with the Chinese government to allow him to first go to a hospital in Beijing, and then later to leave. The U.S. expedited giving him a visa to come and study, and he wants to go back, by the way.
Here is May. This is 2nd of 2012.
Today at around 3:20, I got a very unusual call from U.S. Ambassador Gary Locke, who told me he was riding in a car next to Chen Guangcheng, and he immediately passed the telephone over to Mr. Chen. I just spoke to him for literally a few seconds, less than a minute. He told me that he was fine and he was in the car with the ambassador heading towards Chaoyang Hospital. That's a hospital in the middle of Beijing. Now, we had been waiting all day, really, for some word on his situation, knowing that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had just arrived in Beijing on Wednesday morning. The theory was that they wanted this resolved. Both the American side and the Chinese side wanted this resolved fairly quickly, and before this round of security and economic talks between America and China were set to begin on Thursday. I had, of course, not been expecting to get a call from the ambassador himself and then have him pass the phone over to Mr. Chen directly on the way to the hospital.
What was it? Can you speak Chinese?
I can't. I was actually, believe it or not, I was actually sitting down getting ready for a Chinese lesson at that moment that he called. I took Chinese lessons, probably twice a week when I was in Beijing, trying to improve my speaking ability.
Could you communicate easily with people?
Yeah, well, a basic conversation, sure. You need a translator, obviously, for, high-level interviews, but I got enough that I could actually communicate and get around pretty well. And then my cell phone rings, and it was just the hour that my Chinese teacher was supposed to be knocking at the door. So I thought it was my Chinese teacher. I thought she was calling to say she was late or something. And the voice on the other end said, "Hi, it's Gary Locke." So oh, hello, So that's, and he said, "Hold on, I have somebody here in the car." And he literally just they were on the way to the hospital. He literally passed the phone over, and he said, "It's Chen Guangcheng. I'm on my way." I said, "Oh, how are you?" So, "I'm fine. I'm feeling good." I said, "Where are you now?" And he said, "I'm in the car. I'm on my way to hospital,
Why
Chaoyang
did
Hospital."
they make such a big thing out of that? Why didn't they just let him go?
The Chinese side?
Yeah.
Because I think at that stage it became an affront to them. Because not only did he make his way to Beijing, but number one, he made his way to the U.S. Embassy, which to them was kind of a red flag. One thing they don't like is their dirty laundry being hung out in front of foreigners. And number two, he put out a video, which appeared on YouTube, where he spoke in Chinese, basically saying all he wanted were his rights. He was being detained illegally. He had already served a sentence on trumped-up charges. He was already back home. And they kept these thugs, not even uniformed guards, just thugs outside his home that prevented him from leaving and prevented anyone from going in to see him. Human rights activists, the actor Christian Bale tried to go in and see him and got roughed up. Nobody could go in and see him. And this went on for years. And so he managed to escape. And by putting out this video, he wasn't demanding democracy or anything dramatic. All he was demanding was that his rights be enforced and that the local officials who kept him illegally kidnapped be punished. About
a week after that last video that we saw in your conversation, here's another one about the same subject on the Post website.
I just come back from a 2-day trip to Shandong province to Linyi town, which is the town where Chen Guangcheng is located. His original hometown. So we tried to get into Chen Guangcheng's home village, which is called Dongshigugu. We were stopped at the right turn, the small roadway that goes into his village, by a group of basically thugs who jumped up. They were plain clothes. They were kind of burly, wearing big straw hats because it was quite bright outside, sunglasses. When they saw us, they immediately jerked their shirts up to try to cover their faces. They raced over and started kicking the side of our car and shouting at us to basically move on. We did move on. There were several unmarked cars with plainclothes, we believe, police agents parked only a few yards away. They immediately pulled out and began to follow our vehicle, and they continued to follow us for quite a few miles. We had to make a couple of U-turns just to make sure they followed us. We actually stopped and asked for directions, and the cars following us stopped in unison behind. We finally had to just basically lose them by getting on the freeway back toward Beijing and going at a pretty high rate of speed. This is Keith Richburg in Beijing for the Washington Post.
A couple of things there. It looked like it might have been a Ford following you there. Was that a Ford?
I think so, yeah. I have to go back and look at it exactly. It was quite surreal. It's almost like being in a parade with these 3 black cars following you.
Now, this is not on the subject of the Chinese thing as much as you, as a Washington Post reporter, did you take those photos?
I did, yeah.
And
well, most of them, I think.
And this is all new. When we first talked to you in '97, you wouldn't have done that. You wouldn't have had the internet.
You wouldn't have had the internet. You wouldn't have had a digital camera. I mean, it's the technology has really made the job a lot more fun in a lot of ways, but also we have to do a lot more things at the same time.
Did you like that?
I did. In some ways, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a lot more work, but on the other hand, you can really enhance your stories with a photo like that. Before, I remember the old days when I first went out to Southeast Asia in 1986, going to the Philippines, or I went in and out of Vietnam a lot. And in those days, you'd go to Vietnam with a stack of notebooks and about 50 rolls of film. You'd write down every interview. You'd shoot pictures, and then you came out to Bangkok. And you'd basically take your film and you'd put it in a big black bag and you'd hope that it didn't get exposed. You'd send it by FedEx to Washington, and maybe 3 or 4 days later it would arrive while you were writing your stories up. And that whole process just took forever. Or sometimes you try to get your film developed on site, and then hopefully you could just mail back the negatives to Washington to risk them not getting exposed that way. But now just the idea that something like that happened to me, and I was able to take those photographs from the back window of the car, and literally that same day, or the next day, just ship them in by email. It's a lot more immediacy you can give to the stories now, and there's no question now that I think it enhances the journalism.
When will the Chinese people say we're tired of not deciding who our leaders are and revolt, or will they?
Well, that's a very good question. I think people have been trying to ask that question since 1989, when was the last time there was some kind of a pro-democracy uprising there, and it got brutally crushed. I think there are a lot more people now demanding more rights to have a more say in their future. I don't know if people are specifically saying yet that they want the right to elect their leaders as much as they're saying they want more basic things. They want more freedom of choice in their lives. They want more freedom to read what they want to read. Just in January, there was a spat over a newspaper censorship issue where people just came out in large numbers to protest censorship at this newspaper called Southern Weekend, or also called Southern Weekly, in Guangdong province, because people just got angry that the government was censoring what they can see, what they can read. I think people are also arguing for an end to corruption. They're arguing for basic things like their kid can't get a spot in this university because, some people are using payoffs and bribes to get those kids into the university. So if it bubbles up into a popular revolt, I don't think it's going to be people immediately on the streets demanding the right to elect their leaders as much as it's just basic rights.
On this point, because there's this huge discussion in this country, one of the big differences between China and the United States is, as I understand it, you cannot own a gun if you live in China.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's very, very few people can own guns there. I actually did a story on this growth industry going on of private bodyguards because, there's so many rich people there now. I think there are a huge number of billionaires on the Forbes list living in China. A lot of them are hiring, hiring bodyguards to go with them, as well as these kind of actors and actresses who are quite famous. And when they go around now, they hire bodyguards. The bodyguards are not allowed to have guns, so they use martial arts. It's absolutely fascinating. They had a spate of crimes there that I covered a couple of these. My colleagues did as well, where people were going into kindergartens and stabbing people, but they were using knives or kind of crude kitchen instruments, and they were able to injure, sometimes kill several kids in these attacks. And I thought about it, thinking to myself, what would happen if those people had guns? It's fascinating. The same time that the incident happened here at Sandy Hook, there was an incident in China where someone went into a kindergarten.
One of the arguments here, though, is the reason why people want guns is so that the government never will be able to overpower them. Is that going to be the reverse situation in China, that they'll never be able to overpower the government because they don't have guns?
Well, that's a very good point as well. I don't think the government's going to be overpowered in that sort of a way in China, because I don't know if you necessarily need guns. I mean, for that kind of thing. I've covered a lot of these instances where people have risen up against the government and overthrown it. Indonesia is a classic example where the people were on the streets, and that's a place where there weren't really that many private guns, and the army the police there gunned down quite a few student protesters, including some at Trisakti University in Jakarta. But it didn't take people armed. In fact, sometimes being unarmed in those sort of situations is more effective. Remember the Philippine Revolution in 1986? It was nuns and millions of people in front of tanks holding flowers that got the army to say, hold on a second, we're not going to open fire on these people. These are our brothers and sisters and cousins. So, yeah, I mean, that probably is true that the people will not overthrow the government with guns. But, I mean, in that case, then you've got Syria. Then you've got civil war if you've got an armed population versus an armed government.
You're on your way to Harvard to teach to the Kennedy School students. As you look back on all the places you've lived, if you had to put something up at number one where you enjoyed it the most, where would it be?
Well, obviously, it's hard to beat Paris, because that's a fantastic place to live, and it was a fantastic time to be there. But I think I'd still put Hong Kong at the top, because the time I was there, that 97 transition, was just such a fascinating period in history to actually be there and witness that transition to Chinese rule, to be there before and both after, and to see and to be able to go in and out of China during that period too, which was when Deng Xiaoping's reforms were really transforming China. I would say that would be the most fascinating.
What would you put on the bottom?
I hesitate to say Washington, D.C., because I actually enjoyed my time in Washington as well. I wouldn't put anything at the bottom, because I've had such a fantastic, magical trip, through life with the Washington Post. I've savored every place I've been. The Africa journey for me produced a fantastic book and some great experiences, and I got to, I think, really understand that part of the world. Southeast Asia is always in my heart and blood. I just feel incredibly fortunate. A kid from Detroit, never got to travel much as a kid, suddenly be able to live in all of these incredibly exciting places and have this ringside seat for history. I loved every minute of it.
Keith Richburg, 34 years with the Washington Post, now on his way to teach. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.